Oh, hello. Do you think that Big Brother is watching? Or that the Illuminati is planning to take over the world? Have you happened to have an encounter with a space alien today? Well, if the answer to those questions is yes, then grab your hat. This is tinfoil hat time. Welcome back to Tinfoil Hat Time. This is Tom. Today, we're going to be talking about binding arbitration. And Linux doesn't have any binding arbitration, by the way. So, for those not familiar, what is binding arbitration? This is a legal term, and it means that a person or an agreement, two parties involved in an agreement, agree that instead of taking a dispute resolution to a court, you decide it with an arbiter instead. Now, this has kind of become a huge thing in the last, I'd say, about 5 or so years. What started to happen is going back a long time. Binding arbitration is nothing that's quote unquote new, but with the vast proliferation of everything having terms and conditions attached to it, binding arbitration clauses are getting so commonplace that if you pick up any number of terms and conditions that you have, there is very likely a binding arbitration clause in there. And there's only a few exceptions to that. So basically there are a couple laws about this. There was an original law that basically said, yeah, binding arbitration can occur. And this was, I'm not even sure the origin of this particular law. But what had happened that really started to get binding arbitration out there is, I want to say it was going back to 2002, maybe it was a little bit older, but AT&T was utilizing a binding arbitration to completely strip consumer rights. And in the state of California looked at this and said, well, you can't just sue away rights. It's kind of like you can't put into a contract something that completely violates the law. Like, I'm going to enter a contract with you that says you must kill somebody, because the act of murder violates a higher law, and I cannot have that written inside of a contract. What happens is that portion of the contract becomes null and void, which is why many contracts, if you actually read them, will actually contain a provision, usually near the bottom, that says if any portion of this contract violates any portion of existing law, then the portion that violates a law is omitted from the contract, but the rest of the contract is still in place. And there's a legal term for that, I forget what it is. Well, what happened is in California, you can't strip away all these legal rights. And so AT&T was utilizing a binding arbitration to strip away consumer rights. And this was challenged in court, and it went all the way up the courts in California, and lo and behold, they found that, yeah, you're violating the laws here, and so that binding arbitration is no longer valid. But then they came back and countersued, the company AT&T did. They came back and they countersued, and they said, well, there's a federal law which allows binding arbitration, and since the federal law allows binding arbitration, and all of these people got into and accepted these terms and conditions of the binding arbitration, therefore it's valid. And to my knowledge, I think that case is still going on. So much for expeditious court trials, right? Now, there is actually, because so much stink is being made about binding arbitration clauses, there's actually a new law introduced in the Senate that would ban binding arbitration clauses in many moments, at least forced binding arbitration clauses. And unfortunately, there hasn't even been any movement on that since like the middle of last year, so good luck. So that's kind of a little bit of the background going on here. Here's your major problem with binding arbitration is how widespread it is and how we really don't have much to say. For example, do you have television? Well, if you have television, Time Warner, Comcast, DirecTV, and I think Dish all have binding arbitration. Well, there's 90% of America. The other 10? They might. How about internet? Comcast, Time Warner? That's the vast majority of the internet. There's binding arbitration. Now, with Google coming in, I could not find any forced binding arbitration clauses in any of the Google products and services. Also the same with Apple. There's no binding arbitration clauses anywhere in the Apple ecosystem that I was able to find. However, if you do have an Android phone and you happen to be on the popular Samsung Galaxy line, any of the Galaxies, then there is a binding arbitration in place by using your Samsung Galaxy phone. So if you happen to have a Samsung Android smartphone, unless you specifically opted out within 30 days of purchasing the device, according to the terms and conditions, you have a binding arbitration that you cannot sue the company, which is kind of funny because do you remember the Galaxy Note 7 explosion? Yeah, I couldn't resist. That was a bad pun. On page 18 of the little handbook that came with the phone, there is instructions as to exactly what to do to opt out of the binding arbitration clauses. Now, raise your hand if you read terms and conditions. Okay? Most people don't. And you definitely wouldn't be reading on page 18 of the little manual that just came with your phone because you just got a smartphone. It takes you a month or two to figure out, all the settings, and you're still playing with it. You got the honeymoon stage with your phone, and this thing's so cool. Okay. And then you get this user's manual, which if you're anything like the vast majority of people, myself, I'm guilty included, you get a device, it has this little whatever, usually half in some other language. You take it out, and if you do keep it, it gets thrown into a little bin. Most people just throw the things away. Well, on page 18 of that little manual on the Galaxy Note 7 was the opt-out for the phone. So if you happen to have your Galaxy Note 7 for 31 days, and you've never sent the opt-out, and then your Galaxy Note 7 phone explodes, you can't sue them, whether it's their problem or not. And remember, regarding that phone, there's enough evidence in that actually said that they were rushing the production to beat the iPhone 7 to the market. Because they want to get on there first, so people needing a new phone or involved in the new fancy technology, they'd buy that one. And most people aren't going to buy a Note 7 and an iPhone 7. Although you could argue how much crossover is there. If I'm on an Android phone, unless I really, really want to, I'm probably not going to move to an iPhone. Or if I'm on an iPhone, unless I really, really, really have some abrasive issue with the iPhone, like maybe I want a headphone jack, I might move to the Galaxy if I happen to need a new phone. And so what happens with these binding arbitrations is it's one thing if they're in there to prevent sue-happy people. But usually in our current market, a binding arbitration clause has more to do with allowing the company to get away with whatever they want without the risk of being sued. Because think about the argument, if you've ever seen that movie Fight Club, and he's the narrator, we'll call him Tyler Durden or whoever else he is. He's on the plane talking to a person about what he's doing, and he's talking about these recall issues and all this stuff. And he goes into the number of accidents times the cost of settlement times the probability, and if that costs less than the recall, they don't do the recall. Well, it's kind of the same thing. You know, if you follow and look at what some of the fines and penalties major companies have received for violating consumer advocate, like consumers, it ends up being like Google received one of the biggest penalties. It was like 15 minutes of their income. Yeah, well, if they got away with that for 6 years, made millions and millions and millions of dollars by violating the law, and then get a very small penalty, big deal. The problem with binding arbitration is it prevents consumer advocacy groups from figuring out what's going on, because you get out and you're all loud about the issue, but the binding arbitration says not only can you not take it to court, you actually can't even legally talk about the dispute. That's the problem. So if you had your Galaxy Note phone for 31 days and it blew up, you couldn't sue them even if evidence came out today that said that they absolutely knew these things were going to blow up and they threw them out on the market anyway. Anybody who had the phone for 31 days or longer that did not follow the instructions on page 18 of the little included manual, there's no recourse. None at all. And that's why not only should we read the terms and conditions, we should also opt out of any type of binding arbitration that we can possibly opt out of. Most cases, when you encounter one, there is an opt-out period. Within 30 days, you can opt out, usually by sending some weird email. All right? So these are generally bound within terms and conditions, usually buried deep. But this was an interesting one. I have here the Microsoft one, and this is actually a printout. Microsoft, the head of like the world tech or whatever, needs to figure out how to actually have a functioning print button. There's this print button right there. This is like page 3. They give me like all these 3 pages of this menu crap. They couldn't even figure out how to set a print button to basically you just need to set a CSS style sheet for a print, get rid of all the crap. But here is essentially, if you go to their website on the Microsoft Terms and Agreements, which is Microsoft.com, this is /en-us, it's specifying the language, and /service agreement. Right there, right underneath this, the thing starts. In big bold caps, if you live in or your principal place of business is in the United States, please read the binding arbitration clause and class action waiver in section 15. It affects how disputes are resolved. This is a company that's forcing updates onto your computer that you may not need, you may not ask for, and you cannot control. This is a company that, even when you turn off the telemetry, still seems to be collecting a whole lot of telemetry and sharing it with third parties. By simply using the Windows 10 operating system, Office 365, possibly any Office 2016, I'm not sure exactly on that one, but utilizing any of these cloud-based services in the Microsoft world or Windows 10, and I think also Windows 8 keeps you bound to it as well, you are bound to that privacy policy that could change at any time. You're bound to the terms and conditions that may change at any time, including the binding arbitration involved in their systems. That's kind of scary stuff. Because this is a company that, you know, what is it? I think it's still 85% of all computer systems are utilizing a Windows-based platform. A Windows-based platform, there is an extensive terms and conditions attached. Now, I asked this question once because in my town, our school district has Google email addresses for all of the students. So here's these Google services being attached to all of these minors. I always wondered, and I've asked this to some people, nobody ever had a response. What happens if I, as a parent, don't agree to Google's terms and services? Can my child successfully navigate our school system? What happens if I say, I do not agree to Google's terms and conditions, and I tell every one of those kids, as soon as you are done with school, you delete that email address and you never go into it again. Because whether they say they're doing it or not, I have not seen enough evidence that Google is not building an absolute, complete, thorough, and total detailed profile on all of these kids. So that as soon as they get out of that education system, the day they use that email system not attached to their education, boom, now they can take all that stuff legally and throw it back in. It got to the point where even the personal computers of the kids in the district ended up getting tied into their Google accounts. And I found this out one day when the one person I know, the computer simply stopped working. Like, what's going on? Well, the problem is there was an issue with the Google Exchange, basically the VPN Google Exchange at the school, and even from home, the laptop was trying to go to the school system to work. I'm like, let's delete that. Your computer's your computer. It's a different thing if the school has an issued computer or whatever, but this is your computer you paid for with your money. We don't need it connecting over there because of these binding arbitrations. Now, again, as I said, I was not able to find any evidence Google has binding arbitrations, but their terms and conditions and privacy policies may change at any time. And I don't trust that they're not collecting all this data. So I got news for you. This is a switch to Linux. Did it right this time. Linux doesn't have any binding arbitration. In fact, I even found some Linux distros I couldn't even find in terms and conditions. It's just kind of like, yeah, this is software. It's free on the web. We'd appreciate your donations. There are no terms and conditions with all of the rights and responsibilities involved, which means that you download this thing and it bricks your computer. Sorry. Now, I've never really seen that happen, and if you do end up with a bricked computer, shoot me an email. I'll help you, see if I can't help you get it figured out. But I looked at the major Linux distros. I didn't, obviously, the downside is I can't say that no Linux distro out there does not have a binding arbitration, because there's too many Linux distros. But I looked at your major ones, and I'll get into the caveats in a minute. I looked at Ubuntu with Canonical, Linux Mint, Fedora, OpenSUSE. I forgot to look in Manjaro, but I'm imagining it's much the same. You can barely find privacy policies, terms and conditions, because they just don't collect data. Now, here's your one caveat that caused a lot of issues, and I'm sure somebody will yell about this in the comments, so I'll go ahead and talk about it right now, and that's Canonical and Ubuntu. Because I want to say it was 2012, it might have been later, I can't remember exactly when, but I think it was around Ubuntu 12.04. What happened is in the Unity dash, in the search function, by default, they used to have the internet searches turned on. And the thing is that it would collect not only the search terms, but the IP addresses and send those out to third parties and to Canonical. So things like Amazon, because there is an Amazon app on your Ubuntu computer, and if you use that to shop on Amazon, Canonical actually gets a little bit of a feedback. It's basically just linked to their, hard-coded to their Amazon account, which is, for me, a fine thing. I have no problems with that at all. But I do have problems if I go into the search in the dash in the computer. I do not want it going out and doing an internet search when I'm doing something. And as Joe Collins points out many times, if you are looking for the program Brasaro, which is a CD burning application on Ubuntu, if you go into the search dash and you type, and because I'm not going to sit there and type Brasaro, I'm going to type BRAS, because there's going to be no other program. Well, if you have the internet searches going out, I will see Brasaro and advertisements for bras. I don't need any of those. Okay. So that's a big problem. Now, to Canonical's credit, they did receive a lot of feedback about that. People said, this is not good. And so as of Ubuntu 16, that is disabled by default. And here's the cool thing. All of these Linux privacy policies were very easy to read in a few minutes. It wasn't like 37,000 pages of stuff. It was a couple paragraphs. And Canonical was the only one that I looked at and go, that's a little shady, but that's okay. But it wasn't even shady. Really, it was just fine. If you sit down and read it, it's just fine. I have no real gripes with Ubuntu. I run it on one of my computers. I don't have any issues with it. As long as you make sure that thing is turned off. But they're also very clear, if that is turned off, it's sending no data. And I've looked at Wiresharks and other data sniffing things to verify, indeed, if that's turned off, there's no information going anywhere. It's not like Windows 10, where when I turn everything off, I'm still getting 100 connections to the internet. It's just totally scary to me. Okay, so Linux Mint is my favorite distro. The computer I record these videos on and do all my video editing and uploading and all this, this is a Linux Mint Cinnamon. It is 17.3, although at the end of the night it might be running 18. I'll do another video about the updates and why. But this one here, I couldn't find any terms and conditions, privacy policies, nothing. Getting a little bit of camera lag there. Hopefully we're all right. I looked at OpenSUSE, Fedora. There's a paragraph or two, nothing major. Okay, here's the deal. Linux does not have binding arbitration. Linux has, when they exist, manageable and readable terms and conditions. If nothing else, the terms and conditions, the privacy policies, and the lack of binding arbitration agreements is a very good reason to switch to Linux. Don't buy into all of this Windows rules the world, so I may as well be on Windows. And while I'm at it, let's get this or that. Even if you're on Mac, if you're using Office 365, you're still bound to Microsoft's binding arbitration. Binding arbitration is a bad thing for the consumer. It eliminates the ability for companies to be held accountable by consumers and by the government, because according to many of the binding arbitrations, they're private. You can't see the result. You can't see the dispute. The other thing it does is it prevents consumer advocacy and lawmakers from identifying the common trends. Like if a company breaks consumer laws 5,000 times and 1,000 consumers come forward, if those all get addressed in the courts, a pattern gets observed and it allows regulators to look more closely at the company. However, if these binding arbitration where the results and even the dispute is held private, no one knows there's misbehavior going on. And so there's too much potential to be abused by the company at the expense of the consumer. And that is why binding arbitration is a bad thing. So wear your hat, always read your terms and conditions, opt out of every binding arbitration, and see if there's a service or a system out there that will be an adequate system for you that does not require you to sign away your consumer rights in the name of providing you a service, even a free one. This has been Tom with a tinfoil hat time, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.